Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to wherever it is that you are listening and or watching to this latest episode. Uh, as you can see, yes, like it's been a while. And perhaps as you can also see, I'm back here joined by my special new guest here, King Von. You can see like, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm back from the dead.
Yeah.
Uh, my forehead is crazy,
Yeah,
honestly.
because actually I was saying like,
Um,
okay, the basic point is like, yeah, okay. Do you think you look like King Von, like with the dreads there?
oh no, to be honest, like I did go as King Bond for Halloween once.
Oh, you did, oh, that was King Von.
Yeah, well, like to be honest, like the archetype of like a black guy with dreads, with jeans and a wife beater vest on. You can be anything.
Oh
You could be a
yeah.
rapper on
Anyway,
various ways, but I
so
did
mm,
go as King Bond. I think like last year or a couple of years back. But
wait,
yeah,
do you have a photo of
anyway,
that? Yeah, wait, do you have a photo of that?
I probably would like show you after this episode. But yeah, also
Oh,
for viewers, like for listeners, like check out the YouTube to see my forehead. But yeah,
I was actually gonna say maybe you should put like on the YouTube like a picture of you and King Von. Let's see whether or not that works. Yeah, but
as
anyway,
the episode cover.
what other episode cover like in the YouTube video?
Yeah, potentially, yeah.
Correct. But
Yeah, I
yes,
can think around that. Yeah.
anyway, on the topic of people who break the law, what are we talking about today?
Yeah, we'll talk about the video assistant referees,
Yeah.
the favorite thing of football fans right now,
Mhm.
and just like um what why has there been lots of frustration about it?
Mm.
What's the debates around it? How can it be how can it be improved? And how has it essentially made us think or rethink about refereeing and potentially lawmaking
Yes.
um in football? We did delve in a lot
Mhm.
on like legal stuff in this episode today. To the point where I was actually thinking, this is not legal advice, but yeah.
Well, I mean, like, yeah, it's not legal advice, but like, yeah, like it, as the title of the episode basically suggests, like what we believe is that like VAR has shown us some interesting. Okay, it made us have to think, I think quite critically about what is the nature of both the role of the referee and then also what what function do the laws of the game play in terms of football. And so the obviously we relied heavily on an article that draws quite a lot on legal theory because obviously like there are ways in which the role of the referee and IFAB as lawmakers of the game plays in terms of like as the legal custodians of the game that we go into. So yeah, those are some of the things that we looked into here.
Yeah. I just generally thought it was actually a really good discussion and very interesting papers. And I know you're gonna have a lovely time and you like so much so you'll be like, yes, we're back. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Um, And then obviously just one thing, like don't pay too much attention to the drastic background change that Faniki had to take care of. He was chased away by who chased you away? Was it mom? Or
Well, no, it was dad, but like, he was like I didn't want the cricket stuff being in the background, so
okay, yeah, fair enough.
probably
Yeah.
could have stayed. But yeah, anyway, the background change.
Mhm,
It's how this is for again for YouTube listener, for YouTube viewers. So
mhm.
yeah. But Spotify, it's all gonna be fine.
Yeah. All right. So anyway, yes. So here's leaving you to listen to us from a few minutes ago. Hope you enjoy. So it would be, roughly speaking, like a gross understatement to suggest that the introduction of video assistant refereeing in football has been a um, slightly contentious subject. Definitely, as fans of the English Premier League in particular, ever since it was introduced in, I believe, the 1920 season, and I think also like slightly before that during the 2018 World Cup, it has been met with like certainly a lots of contention concerning its implementation, but then more broadly speaking, with in line with like a lots of calls to scrap it, whether or not like it represents or like it constitutes a certain like harm towards the way in which like the game is official, the game takes place, and also with regards to questions of whether or not like the spectator experience is itself negatively affected as a result of that. And so I don't know, like okay, what I want to do is that like I'll lay my cards on the table here. Maybe you can also say this is the case. Like there are ways in which these sorts of conversations concerning VAR tend to frustrate me, but there are elements of it too that I guess like are understandable. I'd say, or like, what would you make of that? Like, I guess what has been your experience of like uh, fan conversations concerning VR?
I would say that they are getting increasingly negative
Mm,
um, over recent times. Like it's been around 5 years since, well, 5, 6, 7 years since it's been introduced, and it's been going from okay, it's early or it's early doors, we'll
mm,
understand it, to now where it's like I think the excuse of like let's give it time is kind of going down. So um but the thing that frustrates me more is that there's the effect what I would call it the Egyptian Moses effect,
mhm,
where um the new thing that was promised
mhm,
um doesn't really hit expectations. So you have like a nostalgic view of the past
mhm,
where it
mhm,
was like, oh, back in the day, fans I could properly celebrate a goal um without the fear of like VAR intervening and taking away the glory. That's the main thing that's mainly been on it. And also like and to be fair, some of them are legitimate. There's also been the feelings of um back in the day there was never like uncertainty. You didn't have to wait long. You didn't need to be police checked. There was no celebration police. And I
mhm.
think that's what one of the things VAR has become essentially. It's been
Yeah.
sort of appreciating the game. It's probably been policing the game.
Okay, like, and actually, like that point is probably going to be in line with the discussion we're going to be having, which is going to frame this entire episode, which is like VR has made us like it's brought up some very interesting conversations concerning well, what is the role of the referee, and then also what are the roles of like the laws of the game, how they function there. Well, okay, like I want to just maybe briefly start with the fact that there were a couple of articles from the Athletic that I think maybe even you had read that were published, I think, in the immediate aftermath of what was this? Like in the 23-24 season, I remember during the annual general meeting of like Premier League executives, Wolves tabled like a motion to try and like scrap VAR entirely from especially like from the 24-25 season onwards. Obviously that didn't work out, but there were a couple of interesting articles. The first one was a discussion, like a brief discussion between two football journalists from the Athletic, Steve Madley and Amite Winehouse, who are just trying to make like a basic case for and against VAR. Steve Madley's basic case against VAR was it seemed to be like actually it was primarily saying that like the the case against VAR is that it's how can I say this? Like it sacrifices the okay, let me put it this way. Like the people it says that the people who defend VAR are working on the assumption that decision making accuracy is the highest value of the game, and he believes that VAR sacrifices other important values, which he believes is like the spectator enjoyment that you get from I don't know, like the intensity of the sport, of the match experience, and the emotions of it. Like he basically says that the sort of cold dissecting decision making procedures that VARs engage in sort of sucks the life out of it. But then, interestingly, and I think you might have some things to like agree with this. Um, Winehouse suggests that like, exactly what you said. Like, it actually recreates like your whole Moses, the Egypt and Moses point here, which is that like people who are against VAR are suffering from like a sense of what or he calls it pretty privilege, but it's the idea of that you don't know how life is in, as he says it, in like the trenches of English football, where fans are able to see like a lots of decisions that don't
Mhm.
that are obvious and don't go your way. And I think you've mentioned this before, specifically with regards to the women's game, where VAR has been a bit later to come into it. Insofar as like yeah, like people there get to experience like the real sense of agony and injustice from the fact that obvious calls are missed. And I think it leads to the fact that people miss that VR was brought in primarily to eliminate those clear and obvious errors, and has actually been a lot more successful in doing so.
It's it's interesting that you framed it as like a privilege, because it does speak to, not necessarily like a privileged fan, but like a fan of like elite forms of football. But like if you play it in like the grassroots levels and below, and then you get to see the consequences of it. And I think like the counter argument of like that athletic article for decision making not being like decision the counterclaim to the counterclaim of the argument that decision making is like is the main thing that takes the spirit of the game, how I would understand it. From my personal experience, when decisions go wrong, very many people are not happy. Like very many people are not happy. And I think the experience I have is when I think it was Arsenal versus Chelsea women's at the start of the season at the Emirates. Arsenal had 2 goals disallowed critically. The first one was actually 2 goals incorrectly disallowed. The first one was to equalize, and the second was to actually like win the game. In the end, the score ended up 1-1. And I've not been to many women's games, but that was probably like the most, not necessarily toxic, but the most frustrated crowd I've ever seen. Like that's the only time I've seen like the referees being booed, quite frankly. And all the arguments there were just for VAR. So it's like, yes, there is. I do think the claim does have merit, because you can, and I think the decision making accuracy can take away from the fun of the game but that's only if it takes too long. Like if you're on the screen monitoring it, I feel that like for a while, I feel like that's when it does take away from it. Because I do think it's more of a spectrum where like the attention being on the referee is not necessarily a bad thing, because the referee is a part of the game. But like if it takes a while, then I could understand whether I myself are frustrated. And I think this is like another question that I've raised, and I hope like there is a paper that comes out about it. When the referee goes to the screen, they almost always change their initial decision. So there definitely has to be, so perhaps VAR has created some sort of bias, some trustworthy bias of like, if VAR calls it, then they're probably correct. And you can make the case that has made officiating worse, because they lack the critical thinking in that scenario to actually like make an informed decision, rather than just relying on like it's some sort of logical fallacy where like you're following the leader kind of thing.
Okay, yeah, like I get what you're saying there, and yeah, okay. What I'll basically say is that like, okay, what I want to suggest over the course of this thing is that like I do think they're very interesting questions, very interesting philosophical questions that VAR has introduced for us to consider. But I do think ultimately any sort of suggestions or calls to like scrap VAR are just beyond the pale and are made by people who are like either not thinking about it seriously or critically, and or are just operating in bad faith. So I think one important aspect of it is like as you said, like I think a problem of implementation is the fact that I guess like it's at times seems to take too long, and also in other aspects, is the decision making procedure is an opaque phenomenon. And these are certain instances where, like, I remember you shared with me a study by Joachim Spitz and others, 2021, who were able to show that um, there are ways in which VAR has been able to improve referee decision accuracy with the decisions that like are simple binaries, yes or no, that are not up to debate, from like 92.1%, 19.3%, and that a lot of the problem has to do with like the asymmetry of information during the process, and that's what makes it feel longer. So in line with that, there was the other article from The Athletic that was published like in 2024 was discussing some of the ways in which VAR could learn from other from uses of technological aids in other sports to improve it, such as like within cricket, the third umpire decision, and in fact, even like with in rugby as well, with a television match official, the decision-making procedure is made almost completely transparent, such that even when decisions are being made that are regarded as controversial, fans seem to be like a lot more willing to accept those facts because at least they know what was going on there. So, but then again, like but then it's also important to know that like even the perception that VAR takes too long is itself, I think, a bit of a myth, because from the article it said like it's the median VAR check lasts 22 seconds, and like from what I've gathered is like from the in certain leagues like the Bundesliga, it would be maybe as long as 60 seconds, like the total use of VAR checks, to as low as like 22 seconds. So even that one seems to be more of a perception issue. So yeah.
Yeah, but like I think with the opaque, yeah, that is a perception issue. But I think with the opaqueness, it is like the counterclaim that I know IFAB has raised is um they keep it opaque in terms of in for the protection of the referees and the officials involved.
Yeah.
Like that would enhance scrutiny.
But
So
I don't know, but like yeah, I've never bought that. I've never bought that at all, because like especially as cricket fans, um, there has been like increasingly over the years whenever black and white decisions are being reviewed, such as like if has a catch been has a catch been caught, or is it an LBW, or is it a wicket, you can hear like the third umpire speaking and like trying to say like, oh, can you give me this angle, can you give me this that angle, and also like the screen showing the review is shown there in a manner in which like I don't believe is the case in Premier League grounds. And I don't like it's I don't believe that the culture around okay, like the ways in which the refereeing decisions are able to be made correctly or incorrectly is going to be down to whether or not fans are able to see what's going on. Because obviously, there's no way in which the scrutiny of fans is affecting the referees in Stockley Park, because obviously they're not in the stadium to hear like the many groans and the like. And I think additional to that,
okay.
with in addition to that, like when was the practice of the referee like coming forward and saying after review blah blah blah, like like giving his justification what decision was the case, when did that start happening?
I'm not quite so sure, but I do remember it definitely when the women's Euros was happening, they did it. So I
Yeah,
think it's
okay.
quite recent, 2024, I would say.
Yeah, but like that seems to be like, at least that's one way in which the decision making is made transparent to the fans there. Obviously it's like it's not necessarily it's not so much as showing like the complete decision making procedure as much as it is just saying like the final outcome of the deliberation, let's say either internally to the referee or in line with the VAR. But but like there's a way in which that like more of that isn't going to be as harmful as like IFAB and other people try to make it seem like. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, I do, and I do get that, but that is also like, but that's just to like play devil's advocate and make us
Mhm.
and keep us fair. But to be honest, I do think it's um from the obviously the fact that they have gone through the refereeing actually like saying what the offense is,
Mhm.
like the criticism that there hasn't been any spike or regression in terms of refereeing criticism from what I could tell.
Mhm.
And yeah, I think like, but I think I think another kind of worms that VAR has brought up
Mhm.
that I think is worth exploring is um I like let's focus on like I'm thinking about the Arsenal corner situation against West Ham
Mhm.
when Raya was fouled, rightfully so, but then when you have the camera on, let's say you have the camera and it's pictured like Raya getting fouled, but then you can see on the far corner like on different angles the other players are tugging on them. So it's
Mhm.
multiple offenses with different teams. Then which one is favored over the other? And then I think that's And that might result in like a problem of fairness.
Yeah,
But
okay.
obviously, just so
Like,
you know.
yeah, like, okay. It's I think that's an opportunity for us to segue to this article that obviously prior to us recording this, like I've been raving about this article that I recently came across. It's titled Rules, Standards, and the Video Assistant Referee in Football by a man named Jan Ziglinski that was published in 2022. And the central thesis of the article is something that he summarizes quite briefly at the beginning, where he says that the technology, video assistant refereeing, has had a positive impact on officiating in relation to rule-like football laws, while having a much more limited success when it comes to standard-like offenses. So, what is central to this article is the distinction that is made in the title between laws of the game that are called rules and laws of the game that are called standards. Now, what exactly is this distinction?
Mhm.
It's a distinction he borrows from legal philosophy and jurisprudence. And what it is, it's like, okay, so both rules and standards follow a very simple if X, then Y model. Basically, like in the case of law, is that if you are driving at 100 miles an hour, you are over the speed limit, and if you are over the speed limit, you get this fine. So it what all norms basically suggests is that, like, if there is a violation of this particular accepted way of doing things, then this is the outcome of that particular thing. So a rule is a very simple one insofar as these are things that are predefined legal standards and predefined legal responses. So, like as I've already said, like violations of speed limits are quite obvious ones. But an example of a rule, in this case in football, would be what determines what counts as a goal. So if whole of the ball crosses the whole of the line, then it is a goal. And one other example of a rule that he gives, which would be slightly more contentious, but I think he's correct, is an offside. So if okay, I forget what the exact wording is, but like the idea is that in the case of an offside, in the case of an offside, in the case of a rule in general, you are just supposed to find the facts of what makes something count as an offside or not. So like the basis of a rule
Mhm.
is you're trying to find the facts that make something the case so that you can determine, so that you can be able to apply the predetermined outcome of it. But now what makes a standard different is that apart from like the facts of a case, you're supposed to also employ like a bit of evaluative judgment. And the characteristic example of that in football, which he uses, is in the case of things like what counts as unsportsmanlike behavior, what counts as a handball offense in the case of when people determine what counts as like an unnatural position of the defender's arm, and then also what counts as serious foul play, which is to say that what makes all of these things not count as rules specifically is because the sort of underlying principles that you need to employ in order to justify like, or what counts as like a serious foul are the sorts of things that are essentially up to interpretation there. Now, what I think is quite interesting here is that for him, like a rule and a standard are not strict dichotomies, but rather, as he says it, two extremes in a sliding scale. Which is to say,
Mhm.
they're not going to the sort of things that like there are things that can like a rule can become a standard quite rarely though, and then standards can become rules. So a very how can I say this?
So,
Uh, yeah.
with a rule being a standard, is it like the example of how basically the offside is becoming a standard, where there's various interpretations of what offside actually means?
Okay, yes. So like the case of whether or not the offside is a rule or a standard is quite interesting because for him it's the how do I say this, like the instances of marginal offside specifically, because like there are
Mhm.
cases where like if there's like clear daylight, then it's obviously not um, uh, up to interpretation there. But obviously, then the question is going to be the reason as to like marginal offsides could be a question of standard or not is in issues concerning to like what is the margin of error or like what is sort of like like, okay, like how much of a player needs to be beyond the second last, beyond like the last man for it to count as an offside. It's a sort of thing where like there are general principles at play that affect the way a referee is supposed to come to a decision there, but it's up to interpretation there. But now, what I find quite interesting here, and he makes this very interesting suggestion, like not suggestion. He points out an interesting case in law that doesn't work in football, which is to say that like the way in which like applications of standards in the case of ordinary law, where like there's no clear, how can I say this, rule uh, determining what is determining the nature of an infraction, are the way in which those things are handled. Let's say, for instance, like one thing that you hear in law is like in the case of determining whether or not someone has acted negligently, is when the judgment says that like whether or not he has acted in a way no reasonable person would do so. So that idea of no reasonable person is like a standard. It's like a principle that any sort of judge has to bring to bear to when like assessing like negligence there. But the way in which such a standard becomes a rule is when, let's say, case law over time is emerges that shows, okay, like this is how judges have determined what counts as like a reasonable, like what a reasonable person would do. But in football, referees don't act on precedent in exactly the same way.
Yeah.
So like that, what is the interesting suggestion there, like with regards to standards, and is something that like I find quite fascinating because, like to be fair, like there are ways in which inconsistent referee decisions are like de facto punished, insofar as like if a referee is acting in ways that are like too inconsistent, then they will officiate less matches and maybe even become demoted. But I think a problem, like, and especially with regards to like the example you said with the foul on Raya and like assessing whether or not like other fouls are there, is that precedent is not as influential and important with regards to these cases. And as a result of that, the introduction of VR just ends up bringing in another element of like interpretation, or like every case has to be reinterpreted afresh, rather than like being able to rely on precedent to be able to say, okay, this is how the judgment has to be made. This is how VR is going to be able to correct the referees there. So I think that's a very fascinating way of looking at how VAR brings about this aspect of how the laws of the game function, which is to say that like with regards to certain like clear-cut rules, and in fact, this is one of the reasons why like the goal line technology has been such a success, because like you just need to determine was it a goal or not. That's what it has functioned completely successfully because of the fact that it's just a rule. But with regards to standards, given the ways in which um, standard like laws in football work, VR is not helped in that way. So there would be a way in which we need to change how the laws of the game function for VR to be more, I guess, helpful there. So yeah.
So from what I'm getting is just there's actually a lot of things, but like the more I'm looking at is the lack of the insignificance of precedents being put on referees. And that kind of makes sense because that ties into the another criticism of VAR that you always see is, oh, this X was given. So you have a screenshot of Raya, then you have a screenshot of Raya being fouled and a screenshot of Raya punching which Chelsea player? Yeah, punching João Pedro in the face. And then like where's the consistency? And I think one reason why that I would imagine football carries less of a historical significance on precedents is, I think it's what VAR, like, it's very hard to record these things. I'm trying to imagine in throughout the times of football, like throughout the history of football, when if you were to, like, if there was like a foul and an incident, then perhaps like keeping, like in terms of keeping records of it, like describing how a foul, like a certain foul happens in real time, especially like when there wasn't that much TV replays, and you don't have the privilege of having it on very many cameras, then those sorts of fouls and incidents like just gets lost. That's what I would think. But now VAR, for the first time ever, really, you have not only like the abundance of cameras able to capture like in in as much detail as ever before. Very many like able to capture as many incidents as possible. But then it's also one where, because of its existence, those sorts of things are in demand now.
Mm.
Um, with the advent of during when television became a thing and pre-VAR, I wouldn't think there was like much of a demand or clamor to like, if unless the decision was really contentious. I think that's why goal line technology and why goal line technology became so popular. Then those kind of things so like those kind of decision makers just kind of get left in the wayside. But now that you have VAR, it's kind of like introduced this problem that has existed this entire time, but now we've had to come to terms with like actually dealing with it. So it's essentially just like putting out the carpet and seeing that there's dust inside it now.
Yeah. Like
That's right.
I agree with that. And in fact, okay, so what I think is like a major conclusion I think I've gotten from the article here is that I think what VAR ends up doing, it ends up like turning laws of the game that were basically standards and making us have to now try to turn them into strict rules.
Into laws. Yeah.
Like because like they're all laws, but like okay, but like, it's
Yeah,
okay.
but like in the definition of this thing.
Yeah, like these are the terms we're using. We can use whatever we want, but like so like there are laws of the game, and some laws are rules, and some laws are standards. So that's basically what it means there.
Could you just use norms?
Okay, no,
Oh no,
but
no, but norms are like not true.
no,
Yeah,
I
never
know,
mind.
but what he's suggesting is that like, or you can even say like there are norms, and under norms, that there are two types of norms. There are norms that are rules and norms that are standards. So the idea is just basically rules that are things that are very clear cut, and you know, like oh, if this happens, then that happens. Whereas standards are sorts of things where like you're supposed to use that same if then logic, but then but then like okay, like the idea of like if X then Y, but then the question of like what exactly counts as an X, like what exactly counts as a, let's say, a serious foul or
So the
like
original premise is question.
like we'll just say like I think subject to interpretation. And so then the question
Okay.
is like for VAR to be effective, we need to essentially like minimize as much as possible the number of incidents that like are up for interpretation. Now there is an interesting question that comes up from that. Is that a good thing? Like, are we supposed to like? Is there a benefit to leaving like I guess like enough laws of the game to be standards? And like the obvious advantage of like for why the obvious advantage that standards have over rules is the fact that when like in the case of rule, like what rules are like rules have the advantage like you're given like absolute certainty, but in the case where like you disagree with a rule, then you don't have as much leeway to go against the grain there. So for example, like if you are to make the if let's say you will live in a world where like an offside is supposed to be like if there is within let's say like 15 millimeters of like the defender's shoulder is past like the last man, then he's is past last man, then he's offside. There's a way in which like that, yes, that could be the rule, but then it's like that would feel like let's say either unfair or it's like oh it's too much, it's too little there. But like if it's left to be like a standard, it's left to be a judgment call, then you're able to allow a bit more flexibility and not be tied down to those sorts of things there. And so then the question would be like, should we leave such things to be open to interpretation and not have to like rigorously, I guess, say police the ways in which referees encounter new judgments like that? So
So yeah, okay, oh yeah, I was locked into that. Okay then. Um, yes, that's actually a lot that you've said.
yeah,
Um, yeah, but so in terms of the standards, then, um, just trying to think. Like it makes me go back to, I think like when it comes to like the question as to why even bother. I think this is something like worth for the listeners to know is that when we went back to the spit thing, the spit article where it said VAR has drastically improved refereeing decision making. We said it was like 92.3% to 98.1%. And the yeah, and like the claim about it is like similar to this, like it is the or referees are already making 92.3%. So what is like what more do we have to lose? Like, are we really gaining that much if it's only 6% and there's only 2%, 6% gain and there's 2% remaining? Essentially, because if referees are already, you can interpret that as being like referees are already doing a good job. So why even bother like why even bother striving for perfection? And I think the counterclaim to the counterclaim to that is just the uniqueness of football being a very low scoring sport. So the difference of like 5 point something percent between 92 and the 98 is an exponential difference. So one where like the sentiment, like per each percentage point, it's like exponent, it's multiplied by a certain level. And I think that makes sense because of the severity of decisions being made. Like when a decision goes wrong, then that flips the script. But going back to the relationship between standards and rules, I think the conclusion that I'm thinking of is probably we should give, like, there's a debate on whether VAR takes away power from the referees, but I think one solution here is just to give power to them but this is going to be complicated. But I was thinking, like, if there is no precedent being set on previous decisions, should referees become precedent setters?
Because okay, that's the interesting thing. That's the interesting thing because like okay, like using like again this jurisprudential language, like I was wondering to myself that like if IFAB, the International Football, what is it, International Football Association Board, can be seen as like how can I say that? I think I can see them as like
Supreme Court.
I don't even know if that's a Supreme Court. I think maybe they are the legislature because like they're the ones who like
they're the ones who basically make the laws.
Exactly. And then like the referees themselves are the judges, and then maybe the PGMOL in the Premier League and like the respective refereeing bodies in different countries are essentially the what can I say this? They are essentially like the judiciary because they're the ones who are faced with like let's say in any case where like you're faced with the application of a standard and you're faced on like, with a new case that you have to make a judgment on. It could be the case that like as a result of I think PGMOL does like annual reviews of like how referees have done. It could be the case that after like reviewing decisions that are made and looking at contentious decisions, the PGMOL could end up coming say like okay, like based on this, we believe that like we should adjudicate certain, how can I say this, what counts as an example of serious foul play, what counts as a natural as a body being in a natural position. And to be fair, this is actually what has happened because, like for example, in the case of offside, no, sorry, in the case of the handball rule, like the fact that it has been like we have moved to judging it like the ball hitting the hand as being beyond the shirt sleeve is one way of making a standard more concrete and becoming a rule because like and then obviously beyond that could be, if you want to be more fine-tuned in cases if cases arise, we could then say like oh like how much of the ball should be at like some point of the sleeve for that to be the case. So
yeah,
that is an example I think of using previous, let's say, case law to inform future decisions there. And I think the only issue there is like again, it's the enforcement of consistency has primarily been de facto and not been de jure, because like a de jure decision is sort of the case where what de facto versus de jure means. Like de jure means like the law says you're supposed to apply this sort of precedence there, and if you've not done so, then you have made an incorrect decision. Whereas de facto just means like you are it's something more informal. So yeah, that's what the distinction means there. So perhaps unless like inconsistency is something that is monitored in a de jure fashion, whereas like in a case where like cases are become like proper footballing legal precedent, then it will be a lot more difficult to do so there. And one actually interesting way in which I think this is the case is that like what I've been trying to suggest is that like in many cases, standards become rules, and like that's the way in which like things standards for behavior become concretized. But what's his name? Zaglinski does make an interesting note of at least one case in football where a rule ends up becoming a standard. And actually, I don't know, maybe I want to
And
like get you to like guess on what example that would be.
well, the example that I already given was the offsides. But like since you from your reaction, it's not that. And
It's
since
not
you've
that.
raised up the handball one, it's not that.
Mhm.
Um oh so like a rule has become a standard, has transformed
Yeah,
necessarily backwards, but okay. That's interesting. But it's not the handball, it's not that. It is it old?
it's relatively old. What I'll say is that like I think more recent efforts have been made to like clamp down on it and turn it back into a rule.
I tell it back to a rule.
Mhm.
Uh it's not the back pass, it's never the back pass. Um oh, goalkeepers holding the ball.
Correct. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because like it's actually very fascinating because like originally it was supposed to be like a very clear thing. You're only allowed to hold it for 6 seconds and then release it. If not, then you're punished with,
Yeah.
was it an, I don't know, indirect free kick or penalty, one of those things. But
I
then
think it's probably an indirect free kick. Penalty is a bit too harsh.
okay, yes, something like that. But then, over the course of like I guess like the several decades after it was introduced, simply due to like under officiating, it ended up being the sort of thing where like referees would be sort of like using their judgment of like, oh, does this seem like it's too long? Does it seem like it's too short? So to the point where like I'm pretty sure you can end up seeing like, oh, the goalkeeper is able to like hold it on for like far longer than the
Yeah.
rule, the letter of the law was supposed to say there. So then, obviously, as right now, it's the people have had to like crack down on it like a lot harsher, a lot more harshly there. So then again, like that's an interesting example there because what it is showing, it's like it's the question of um what is the level of like I don't know judgment that should be allowed there, and what are the justifications concerning how do you clamp down on certain actions or the exactness with which you're supposed to get those calls right. Yeah, so I think
Yeah.
that's an interesting point.
Yeah, that's a question. Because so in that kind of a case, then like there is proof that referees, even subconsciously, have the ability to like make a precedent to
Yeah,
certain rules.
yeah.
And so potentially going down that route of like I think psychologists are yeah, going down that route and just I think the problem with this like it is like a bit I could see how it can get a bit uncomfortable because um and the way I'm thinking is like imagine like if Anthony Taylor makes this decision in this other game and now we have to follow it because that decision has been made and that's
Mm,
interpretation, then like I can imagine how that could be an uncomfortable thing, but at least that does like make the lines a lot more finer. And and just again to reiterate, just the fact that we have had well, just the fact that like even that goalkeeper that rule became a standard and no one really I remember no one really followed it. And
mhm,
when it was did it I don't think it was like if it was to be followed in like your local Sunday league game, like everyone would just turn and look at the referee being like, why are you being a sweat? When you
mhm,
should have been like no one else is doing it. So like why are you doing it?
mhm.
And yeah, so like I think an interesting conclusion is just like whichever the referee's interpretation of it, that should be set as the president. And I think that obviously puts more trust on the referee's qualities to like deduce um these deduce these interpreting like this interpretive
Mhm,
incidents that happen with football. And
mhm.
yeah, I think I think the thing that really makes it interesting is that like it provides an avenue where referees are actually gain more power
Mhm.
with the advent of technology when when the questions of VAR is that like does it take away too much of the power? And I think
Yeah.
and one interesting question that like comes from VAR, and the question that comes to VAR defenders is we are pursuing, if we keep on pursuing accuracy and inevitable, and let's say we somehow get to 100%, then what is the point of having a physical referee there when we can just use AI?
And okay, like that actually raises an interesting point. Or like even like without even going to AI, the question is like, can we? Why can't we like fully automate certain decisions there?
Yeah,
And in the Athletic article talking about what is this? What is this thing? In the Athletic article talking about like how like the Premier League could learn from other sports. There was an interesting instance where like I think um writers for two different sports, even though they didn't directly contradict each other, they sort of raised opposing positions. Whereas because so like the sports writer for the NFL was suggesting that what VAR could implement is the coach's challenge, where it's like I think like I forget what the specifics are, but like a team is allowed to challenge a referee's decision this many times, and then the referee is able to like go consult with like their version of the VAR, and then also like look at on-screen things there. But then what the tennis writer suggested is that like in the case of tennis where players were always able to challenge calls, um, the introduction of like more automated decisions for like things of whether or not like the ball is in or out that came around as a result of COVID was perhaps even more beneficial, because in tennis there were instances where like high profile instances apparently where players simply failed to challenge a decision that replays ended up showing was absolutely correct. And I remember like
yeah,
the was it like the CEO head of the City Open, which is one of like the tennis competitions on the tour, just said that like we go for automation because like the automation is just like better than the human there. But now the issue is, and I think this is what like I find like just like amazing about this article, is as he explicitly states, VAR, or we could just say technological assisted decision making automation in general, is fantastic for rules, for laws of the game that are rules, insofar as like there is a predetermined insofar as there's a predetermined action that leads to a predetermined conclusion, and your job is just to decide whether or not like the facts of the case are such that this case determines this particular action. So in tennis, has the ball gone out? Yes or no? You don't need a human to do that. You just need automation there. Has in
mm-hmm.
cricket, is this an LBW or not? Is the impact in line or not? You have to do so. And so automation is possible insofar as you have rules, but insofar as you still have standard like laws of the game, things that require interpretation, then automation cannot take place until you have turned those standards into. So then the question is going to be like, is there any justification to keep um, those aspects of the laws of the game that are up to interpretation? And it's something that I'm not yet like I'm not yet like made a decision either way. But like I'm not 100% opposed to that idea, because I'm not 100% opposed to the idea of like trying as much as possible to make the laws of the game rule like as much as possible.
Yeah,
But like okay, but what I will say is that like there's a sense in which like that is, I guess, not necessarily possible. But that's the reason why, at least in law,
yeah,
what counts as a rule for application ends up being the accumulation of precedent. And so maybe that's what,
yeah. That's what I was gonna say.
yeah, that's what's brought there. And actually, I'm even wondering, like, have there been discussions about in the case of law of introducing AI? Okay, I don't know, or like not even AI, just like automation. Like, but anyway, like the point is that like, what exactly is the role of automated judgment, and especially considering the fact that like there are aspects of evaluative judgment that automation cannot eliminate there. So like that's the important point to note there.
Yeah, and I think like so now, and I do also largely agree
Mhm.
that I would I'm more leaning towards like having standards become rules. But then I think the problem with me, like, well, the paradox of having a standard become a rule is the standard bearer, the person who makes that transition, well, like a standard becoming a rule needs interpretation. like inherently.
Mhm.
And I think that's a good thing because like that results in like, well, that keeps the like it keeps the human individual referee significant.
Mhm.
Um, so in terms of like making that transition to make it more hardline. But the thing with standards becoming rules is that yes, it's it's kind of like a scientific, when you make a scientific claim, it can be, what's this thing? Like it can be challenged, it's falsified. Yes, that's
Mhm.
what I was looking for.
Mhm.
When a standard becomes a rule, more often than not, it's much easier for it to be falsified and perhaps change, or maybe change back to a standard, but also
Mhm.
have the rule initially made to be changing. So um, that's what I'm thinking about, like in terms of like making referees, in terms of like the question about whether officiating should be automated. But the very nature of like sport in general, I think one thing that everyone has to admit is that um, interpretation is always going to be there,
Mhm.
especially as the sport, especially if the sport is as continuous and not
Mhm.
as discrete as football. But when, but from the discussions that we're having is that like that's where like essentially like when it comes to the referee, like when it comes to referee, the and I think what we've learned from when it comes to VAR is that like the interpreting skills of the referee is what the referee is not an enforcer, as we've seen, of the law,
Mhm.
but more of an interpreter. And I think that's one thing that like that football has been beginning to learn, especially
Mhm.
with the advent of VAR.
Yeah, yeah,
And yeah,
yeah. Yeah, like I mean, like as I said, like
no, yeah, that's what I'm saying.
I think like the referees and refereeing associations are essentially like the judiciary in like in this particular situation, because like yeah, like they like what the function of the judiciary is to like determine whether or not certain cases involve following or not following of the laws that are supposed to be governing the they're supposed to be governing, like in this case, like the land or like the jurisdiction of football there. So that's what the referees are supposed to be the case. And maybe like what VAR is showing us is, like as you said, I think maybe to take a bit more seriously that role, that interpretive role that referees as judges of the game are supposed to take on there.
Like they're
Yes,
not policemen, they're judges.
yes, yeah, actually, yeah, perfectly said. Yeah, referees are not policemen; they are judges. Yeah, so
Yeah.
yeah, that's the case. So now, like now, apart from that, like, so I think going over some things, like I think there are some aspects of VAR that where criticism is a bit overblown and can be like taken care of with regards to better implementation. So, like as you said,
Mm-hmm.
like the complaints around like how it's like
The
just like taking
opaqueness.
yeah, yeah, opaqueness can be fixed there by I think making like the decision making more transparent to like the fans, both like TV fans and also on-field spectators. It can also be made also the fact that like the idea of it being I think too long is something that maybe also has to be demystified, because maybe like the obvious cases where it goes wrong is might be one aspect of it, but like for the most part it doesn't work. It's not as bad as there. And then also in cases such as like in cases where margins of error are how do I say this are are present, it could be the case where like the laws of the game will have to be changed such that like where we had standards in the case of like offside, we have rules such that like and I think semi-automated offsides are sort of like one way of going at that, because if we're able to
Yeah.
communicate that like this is what counts as an offside and like these sorts of marginal areas is where like I don't know within how many millimeters counts as an offside or not, and that's something that's always going to be the case regardless of how you want to draw the offside lines. That could be one way of doing so. But very briefly, um, okay, actually, there are two things I want to get at. There was this interesting idea that the athletic writer, what was his name? What was his name? What was his name? What was his name? Yeah, Amite Winehouse, when he was presenting his case for VR, he was sort of suggesting that the skills that are required to be an on-field referee are perhaps not the same skills that are required to be a video assistant referee. And like
Yeah.
he put it basically like in terms of, how did he say it? Like the person who would be best for being the VAR is sort of like a laws of the game nerd who is good with the mouse and who is happy to just be sat in a box at Stockley Park away from all the shouting and screaming and the like. And so,
Yeah.
with regards to the questions of introducing, let's say, legal precedent to the laws of the game, perhaps you could say that, like, okay, like the on-field referee is not the person who is maybe best equipped to make those sorts of snap memory judgments in that case, but perhaps the VR is someone who actually could be equipped to do so. So, like, if how can I say this? If standards, not standards, how can I say this? If precedent is the sort of thing that could
Yeah.
become a lot more enforceable, then perhaps the VAR could be a lot more useful in terms of saying like, oh, in this similar situation, this how many years ago, this sort of decision, like there was a similar case like this was made. Whereas, and in fact, it could even be a way of telling the
Yeah.
referee, hey, like you made this decision last
Yeah.
how many weeks ago, for consistency, you also need to make this case there. So I think that could be also another way of doing so. Like that, yeah.
Yeah, that could be a very interesting thing. And yeah, that actually is an interesting thing. And like if having that, just think about like and having would you be okay with having that like being transparent, like having conversations? Um, I would imagine like put on air, kind of like how it is in cricket. You hear like
Yeah,
you hear the guy in the studio talk with the umpire over there.
yeah, 100%. And okay, like the interesting thing is like in line with that, okay, there was this one argument against VAR that like actually like really, really pissed me off, which was that like essentially
Mm-hmm.
it went somewhere along the lines of like the pursuit of accuracy is going to rob the fans of the joy of debating contentious decisions, blah blah blah. And one like that just strikes me as like
It's
transparently
like
bad.
it's fun. Well, yeah.
Yeah, like I don't know, yeah, it strikes me as like transparently bad faith. But based on the suggestion we've been discussing here, I think there is a way in which like room for discussion can still take place in the cases where like, and I think rugby has this element insofar as like you can hear the TMO and the referee get into discussion there,
Mm-hmm.
but hearing like the referees like discussing like the implementation of precedent in cases is something that could actually can be very interesting and still spark debate there. And so like I don't think that's going to be taken away. It's just a matter of like seeing how VAR can be used as an avenue of making precedent more enforceable there. Now, there is still that element of whether or not like will that make things like a bit slower. And the fascinating thing that's Glincy makes, another fascinating thing that Glincy makes in his article is that the issue of speed seems to be a, how can I say this, like a peculiar cultural quirk within footballing environments that treasure speed. And what he means by this, and in fact, like he cites
Mm-hmm.
Jonathan Wilson, which is the fact that like in the Premier League specifically and other leagues, given how faster paced the league has become, and then secondly, given like the preponderance within English football to favor traits that involve like speed and like strength and the likes of that, it seems to be the case that within like England, those sorts of questions of actually like, oh, decision making is a bit too slow, has been more prevalent as opposed to other footballing cultures and besides, I think, Spain, France, and Italy that are
Yeah.
like that don't. And I think even actually even in the US where like they're so used to those sort of things. So it's also like it just seems to be like a cultural thing. So like it's even maybe I'm wondering, like the more VAR is there, the more we maybe like become acculturated to the fact that like okay, yeah, like maybe there's some that times decisions need to be take like a bit of time. There's a question of like, oh, what counts as like too much time within reason, but then it's like I don't
Yeah.
necessarily think that's like um, it could just be like a cultural thing that has to be developed over time. Like a cultural willingness to like accept that this is how long VAR decisions take. But other than that, I don't necessarily think that's like a problem. It could just end up being the case that certain old heads will have to like rage at this generation, saying like back in my day, 90 plus 3 minutes was all we had to wait for matches to extend it. But like obviously nowadays we're perfectly willing to accept the fact that matches can go for 102
90
minutes
plus
and
10,
that's
yeah.
so yeah, so that it's also like an element of like acculturation to ways in which decisions are made over time. So yeah.
Yeah, and like okay, yeah. I think the issue I would see from maybe an English perspective is that like, and I think the way you said it as to how like perhaps in America they'll be more accepting of it because of like the many breaks and stuff.
Yeah.
Um, I would imagine that like it could be interpreted like this, like just us, just them, like being more cultured to it, could be countered by saying that potentially this could be like a sort of Americanization of the game where
Yeah.
breaks and stuff are more like encouraged. And it could be seen in the same lens as how this World Cup final, there's gonna be a there's gonna be a halftime break. Like get on with it. So like obviously they're obviously mutually exclusive, but I could see how they could be convoluted in a
Yeah,
way.
of course. Yeah, of course. But like like ultimately the thing is that like Americanization is not always a bad thing, and this is due to the fact that like there are many sorts of things that are like Americanizations that we no longer think of as Americanizations, namely things
Jerseys at the
introduced.
back.
Sorry.
Jerseys at the back of shirts. I mean, no. Names at the back of shirts.
Exactly,
Yeah.
yeah. So like that, it could be the question is just going to obviously I think like the issue that people have with like like the delays in sporting events is because people use those delays to just push commercial and stuff like that, and that's obviously annoying.
Yeah.
So it's like obviously there's the game idea of NFL being I don't know 40 minutes of actual gameplay or like 36 minutes of actual gameplay. I
Yeah.
don't know how much. So there's that obviously
It's so
thing.
bad. Yeah.
Yes, but the idea, and in fact, actually, this goes with the fact that like there are two things. There are two things I think that American sports have adopted that I guess European football has lagged behind. Obviously, there's apart from the jersey numbers thing. Obviously, there's the adoption of like a lot more serious attention placed towards like enforcing concussion protocols. But then apart from that, it is the utilization of technology in sports. Like there's a way in which like a European sports, but I think English football specifically has been quite hostile to the adoption of decision review systems. And it's actually quite fascinating because it always strikes me like how cricket adopted the decision review system like a lot more recently than football did, because like cricket just strikes me as
Yeah.
like a very conservative, very Tory type of sport. And from what I see, like yeah, there was sort of opposition towards um, its implementation from like traditionalists, and I know even like the BCCI Indians cricket governing body like also fought quite heavily against it. But the very idea of introducing technology into it and like maybe taking moments to slow down the decision making process to get things right is not as bad a thing as people try to make it out to be. Now, this is going to lead me to like another interesting argument that I think we've touched on earlier in our discussion, which is whether or not like it takes away from the emotions and from the spectacle of it. And there's an article written by I think it's an African American author named Tamban Landu that
Mm-hmm.
is titled, what is the title of it? Oh, The Fallacies of the Assumptions Behind the Arguments for Goal Line Technology in Soccer. Now, note that it's an argument against goal line technology, firstly. And it's like, given
I know
this,
I'm just doing it.
yeah, like given the overwhelming success of goal line technology, like it's quite interesting. It was published in 2012 when it was still like a contentious issue there. But like his basic argument is against um okay, let's say not against. His basic argument isn't specifically towards goal line technology, but towards like the implementation of technological aids in refereeing in general. And what you're suggesting is that it is based on the what he regards as a fallacious belief that refereeing decisions play an important role in the outcome of the game. And we've already covered a counter argument to that, which is, as you said, that refereeing decisions do play an important role in football, considering the fact that it is a low scoring game. So okay, so what he wants to suggest is that like the individual decisions that we should regard as being the most important are tactical decisions, technical decisions by individual players, and the like. And so to to act as though the referee's decisions play such an important role is to turn a spectacle to the judgments that the referees make, when the true spectacle is supposed to be the play like the players do make there. And so yeah, I guess like that's the point that is make. What is your reaction to that?
From what I think about it, it's like, oh, as you've said again, it's based on a premise that is incorrect. And when it comes to like refereeing decisions, if you look back in football history, has had an impact on quite a number of games, and to the point where like not only had an impact on games, but also in like the like very many of the greatest football moments
Mm-hmm.
and people's greatest football memories has been on has hinged on refereeing decisions. And I think the best example, I think, like maybe like for English viewers, is their greatest ever moment, like period, in football history was on a goal that was disallowed. That a goal that should have been disallowed. And people and that has taken up its own mythos more so than the fact that people recognize like England were a really good. If you watch the game back, England were a really good team. They played better than West Germany. Um, Alf Ramsey maximized the likes of Bobby Charlton and Bobby Moore, um, had the wingless wonders, was tactically ahead of everyone else. No one remembers that.
Mm-hmm.
Like literally no one, like unless you like are a football historian. If you ask the casual, if you questioned the casual English fan about the about the 66 final and like, oh, the ball crossed the line or not, the counterclaim is no always never going to be about like, oh, but we were the better team anyway because the way we played was better. It would be like, it is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes like sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. So it's in that sense, like it's an appreciation. That is an implicit appreciation of decision making and refereeing decision making being a significant part of the game. To the same level, and sometimes even being more so than the typical um the typical examples of what makes the spirit of the game, like i.e., technical play, tactical play, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And you can list if you've actually thought about it for like a couple of seconds, you can list several things like even the Maradona's fantastic performance against England. I would argue that the hand of God is more memorable than the goal of the century itself,
Mm-hmm.
which is another example of that being the case. Germany absolutely this is becoming a lot English centric. Germany blitzing them in 2010. Less appreciation on like their counter attacking brilliance, more so on like the decision, like more so on the Frank Lampard incident, and even to an extent you can even say Arsenal. There's what has contributed to that the hatred and the way we engage with Arsenal is the idea. Also, same with Man United as well under Sir Alex, that like, oh, you buy the referee, or you have you always get the rub of the green. No appreciation on the fact that like you guys, you guys can and more often do play good football, and same with Man United at the time. So, and you can go on and on. Like even now, I've just thought about like the whole Barcelona 0809, how Chelsea fans are still bitter
Mm-hmm.
on that semi-final when in reality Barca were just a really good team. And you could always go on, and even with the 10-11, Van Persie's weird red card that eliminated you guys. Barcelona are just a really good team at the same time. So you can just so when you think about when you think about the narratives that have shaped us as football fans, those narratives are governed. You can find a lot, I wouldn't say majority of the time, but a sizable minority of the time,
Mm-hmm.
where these narratives are being carried by refereeing decisions more so than the qualities of the players themselves.
Okay, yeah, I agree with you on that point, but I think a counter argument to that would, uh, okay, because obviously what you're saying is a descriptive claim and a true descriptive claim, which is that like a number of times when
Yeah.
in our recollections of the narratives we make concerning like how matches went, and especially like the counterfactual narratives, namely in terms of like how this or that thing affected the outcome of the game and what would have happened if it didn't happen. Those are sort of things that are affected on like individual moments. Some of those moments being around refereeing decisions. And actually, in fact, we don't even necessarily have to go on like refereeing decisions that like made things that were incorrect or not. Because one of the examples, and this is maybe like a testament to goal line technology success. John Stones' goal line clearance in the 2019 match against Liverpool. Like that's the sort of thing where it's like if GLT wasn't there, then that's probably given as a goal, and so that affects the outcome of the game, and maybe like Liverpool going to win the title there. But Landu makes a very interesting. Okay, like this article is rests on like a claim that he makes on a previous article that he published before, which is that what was it called? The title of the article is "One Play Cannot Be Known to Win or Lose a Game: a fallibilist account of game," and he makes the criticism there that informs his criticism of arguments for technology in sport, which is to say that like the whole retelling of sporting games and incidents that focuses on individual moments as having outsized effects on the outcome of a game is itself a problem. So his argument is, I think, even more extreme, which is to say, like, not only that refereeing decisions don't play such an outsized impact on games, but even individual moments of like skill or goals or like boneheaded moments are okay. I don't think he says that like they don't play an outsized performance, but like whether like what sort of impact they do have is something that like we cannot know with certainty. And so, in the case of refereeing decisions, the idea that bad refereeing calls play such an outsized effect on a game, unless you're able to show that the referee was like, let's say, deliberately trying to make bad calls. If there are like what like a few mistakes there, like he says that suggesting that we can know that they play such a significant impact on those games is something that like maybe we don't have we don't have enough good reason to believe so. So maybe that's the assumption that's resting behind like the attempt to like make things more accurate or not. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think the only I think this coming back full circle. The only reason that I would perhaps go against that and what comes off the top of my head is um I think it's what makes football different from like cricket and basketball is, as we said again, it's the low scoring nature of the sport. So obviously we cannot we will never you will never truly know how how uh, how
Mm.
how the course of a game would go if a refereeing decision went the other way. That's the point. The decision is made, it's final, and you just move on.
Mm-hmm.
But we can obviously make an informed decision that we can obviously make an informed decision that the the referee's choice would have had a significant effect on it. And that's because of the low scoring game. Because if with football, on average, 2.7 goals per game, if I think this is more towards like decisions that result in whether it's a goal or not. If this thing goes into a goal, if this decision like determines whether a goal is being scored, that is like nearly half of the total of the expected outcome of an entire game.
Yeah.
So, but by that claim, by that you can make the logical argument that this decision that was made carries a significant value to, I think it may not be 50% of the total effect of the game, but it's definitely going to be like around 45%,
Yeah.
40,
Yeah.
40 or so percent.
Yeah.
So that's where um it's that's where the decision where this thing kind of falls flat. Especially in the scenario where like where these decisions are directly leading to a goal, whether a goal is scored or not. You could argue like, I can understand it being more why I can understand putting it more to question when it comes to stuff like players sending off, player sendings off, because an example is that like was David Beckham like did David Beck if when David Beckham got sent off against Argentina, was that the catalyst that made England lose the game? Probably not. Because like they held on for like an hour and lost on pens. And apparently, here's a rule that like, but you know when it comes to penalty sidetrack, when it comes to penalty shootout and one team is down to 10 men, the other team has to get rid of a player.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Uh, yeah. So like it's 10v10. Yeah, I don't know. Like, okay,
Interesting.
I do know that was the case when Zidane like headbutted Materazzi and Gattuso was not in the penalty list. But anyway, yeah, that just shows that like so with stuff like red card decisions, they are more up to debate because you can't clearly um it's harder to clearly put like a number on it. But with a goal, then that's the case. So that's the main counterclaim. So at the very like best case scenario, anything that refereeing decisions that don't directly lead to a goal, hold less value in determining the outcome of a game.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and obviously, okay, this obviously has to be. It touches on instances where VAR is called to step in, and of course, like VAR is supposed to step in like in four distinct situations, like you said, goal, no goal, offside. Um, I think goal, no goal, offside, penalty, and mistaken identity, something like that.
Mistaken identity. Yeah.
Yeah. So like now, of course, in cases where like maybe they don't have a similarly outsized incident, like outsized how do I say this, effects on important outcomes of the game, like those ones. Um, those sort of things where like you probably like you utilize like let's say coaches or players challenge like challenges like are exist in like many sports such as like cricket with appeals. In basketball you have that in the NFL, and so those would be like quite very interesting ways of doing so. And like I think ultimately for me, what I think is interesting about VAR is that it makes it brings in new questions, and I think makes football a lot more interesting. And those are the sort of discussions that like I would want us to have rather than like calls to scrap it. So for example, one interesting thing I've been wondering about is like with regards to questions about like what should count as an offside. The reason as well, like I guess it has been a bit of like a question regarding a standard, is because you could say like the basic underlying principle is that a player should not essentially have like an undue advantage vis-a-vis like the defending team, because if they are kama in Kiswahili, if we're able to say kama mchezaji anaweza kuotea hapo, you can just wait for the ball and then score that way. But now let's say if we were to amend the offside rules, so because like right now we're looking for if there is a fraction of the player that is offside, then he's offside. Whereas let's say if we to change it such that if a fraction of the player is onside, then he's onside. So that could be one way of like changing the rules there, which is I think what that daylight system brings about. Now, people who are proponents of this daylight system neglect the fact that there are going to be questions of margins of error, which is like within like
Yeah.
marginal offsides, like what counts as how much of it should be
Daylight.
should be how much of daylight is daylight essentially. Yeah, and I think ultimately if we're able to bring in like a semi-automated offside system that has a margin of error wherein linesman's call is able to function, that would be perfectly fine. But I would not be opposed to that system because like think of like um the tactical shift in football that would bring about. Like if a player is able to be on side within the margin of daylight. See, that would obviously mean that perhaps teams will be incentivized to play with lower blocks because obviously, like you don't want to give any sort of a striker who is able to run in behind that sort of opportunity to run in behind. And then obviously afterwards, does that mean that if teams catch on to that sort of way of playing, does that mean that players who are good at running behind end up becoming more and more irrelevant as players who are able to hold the ball in situations where there are low blocks become more into effect. And so those are sort of questions of like, okay, what are the sorts of tactical evolutions that rule changes, that law changes that VAR institutes are going to end up bringing about there. So those are the sort of questions that I think like are worth having in terms of VAR. Whether or not we should scrap it or not are just not the sort of things that I think anyone should be interested in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, that is true. Like, and I think that's probably one like uncomfortable question. Like people aren't. I'm not sure if sports fans in general, but definitely football fans are like adverse to change. Um, especially change that like leads to such radical things. Because even when it comes to like even think about when the back pass law was introduced,
Mm,
how
yeah.
there was a lot of pushback on it. Personally, um the daylight offside thing, like the current offside law is like perfectly fine in itself.
Yeah.
Um yeah, but yeah, there is like like it does bring more opportunities like for the game to expand and be seen in and to be ultimately seen in a new light because obviously as you did raise in there the question of whether coaches how to say question whether coaches and or captains can do like can well not necessarily like can appeal can make if that possibility comes up then perhaps when managers are on the dugout looking at that mini screen, that perhaps means that like there's an extra coach who's watching to keep in tabs to see if like there's anything untowards coming for an appeal.
Yeah.
And as a fact, like one thing that could make like especially like coaching or maybe captaincy or perhaps both, a quality could be determining is like having like the foresight and the thinking to determine when to use
Hmm.
your your appeal and when not to. Um,
Yes. Yeah.
personally, I'm just saying this like as like avenues to improve the game. Personally, I'm I'm more against the appeal system
Mm.
because I do remember this Ashes period. There was this time in the Ashes in 2019 there was a crazy one. Um, we appealed for something that Australia
Mm.
appealed for something that was false, used up all their appeals. Then when I think Nathan Lyon like did an LBW that was like
Oh
bang
yeah.
on,
Yes.
and then
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that was
Yeah.
exactly. And then so that does happen, and then also well, obviously it would be like how it does get counted in the higher levels when you have like when you do have TV cameras everywhere. But from my experience as a coach, bro, you so many things just go over your head.
Hmm.
Like you're like at full time, you come back and then like your players say like, oh, this player was tuning me, like was
Mm.
like stepping on you and all that kind of stuff. Like, bro, you can't see that.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I can't see that. You can't see those nitty gritties. But even so, like VAR just bringing up that possibility. Um, yeah, VAR bringing up that possibility has like caused a tactical shift. And I could imagine as a prediction then if especially like stuff like grappling in corners becomes more like if stuff like grappling in corners becomes more punishable, then perhaps the way corner kick like set pieces are attacked and or defended
Hmm.
could potentially be something that could be changed in the future.
Hmm. Yeah.
And
Like.
perhaps like
Mm.
a more zonal, like I could see perhaps a more zonal approach,
Yes.
especially
Yeah.
towards corners,
Yeah. Yeah.
rather
Exactly.
than
Yeah. Yeah.
like the love chain. Oh my God, that love chain that Arsenal do. So, oh,
Yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, like again, yeah, again, that's an interesting question, yeah, because like obviously like how rules change in sport. Okay, like for the purposes of this, let's say, let me not say rules. How laws change in sports in football affects like the ways in which tactics end up moving and stuff like that. One thing I will say is like you brought up the point about like the balance between having like an appeal system versus like a referee stepping in or like an assistant video assistant referee stepping in to like present automated calls there. And like the Ashes example you brought is a good one. And I think to use another cricketing example, I do think at least in the IPL they've done okay. Basically, the important thing is I think would be to bring about a balance wherein you can involve like an appeal system on one hand, then also allow the video assistant referee
automation.
to, yeah, like automated decisions wherein like the case of like someone has obviously missed something there. And in the IPL, in the case of let's say previously in cricket, the a square leg umpire had to look for instances where there is a no ball and be able to call it. Right now, that system is completely automated. But then, even apart from that, in cases where like the team believes that like a correct no ball call hasn't been called or an incorrect one has been made, there is still room to appeal there. Now, I will say it could be the case that, let's say, certain standards become more concretized into becoming rules. What that will end up meaning is that there are instances where those decision making has to become a bit more automated, and therefore the need to appeal something may either be eliminated or just like end up going still towards cases that are still like leftover cases that are still up for interpretation, let's say. And
Yeah.
in those cases, okay, like in those cases, like again, like it's going to be a case of I don't know how I don't know how much it's actually it's going to be an interesting tactical question for players and coaches to think. It's like if you believe that that a particular decision is a matter of interpretation, a way that has gone your way, would appealing it make good tactical sense if it is a case that the referee might end up feeling like, oh, there was no really need to overturn it. But otherwise, yeah, like that's an interesting question to have there. So anyway, long story short, VAR brings about like very interesting ways in which football can develop. And so we should be able to like focus on
Yeah.
those discussions and not like wanting to scrap it all together, especially given the fact that it has been very good for eliminating eliminating the decisions that are clear and obvious errors that were the whole reason as to why it was brought in the first place. So yeah.
Yeah, and also like and I think just like as we wrap up about it is that I think that's the sad thing about like officiating as a whole is that the positives will like by its very nature will go unnoticed because
Mm-hmm.
obviously the saying of like a good refereeing performance when you don't notice them, um, a good call more often than not are the ones where you don't even notice that they've happened
Yeah.
and the game just flows naturally to the
Mm-hmm.
point where you don't even acknowledge its existence.
Mm-hmm.
And just to go back to the statistics of like from 92% to 98%, um, that 92% of like refereeing accuracy shocked me
Mm-hmm.
precisely because I didn't recognize, like, you don't recognize when things go right
Yeah.
more often than not. Like, a foul is a word, like, let's say like a foul happens,
Mm-hmm.
the ref calls it, the player by proxy has to like the player that's fouled, the player that's made the foul by proxy, like makes an appeal, like says, oh, what are you doing? And then like the ref just ignores it and the play just continues and you forget about this thing ever happened.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so as for like, and I think that's how it replicated with VAR because it's a lot harder to find the times where VAR has worked, but it's a lot easier to find when like VAR has not.
Okay. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
obviously, it would be a lot more boring to just put like a whole compilation video of when it has worked. And the unfortunate thing about it is that like it creates this false perception of it having not been the case. But obviously, like to wrap up, like one important thing is that like it's how potentially a route that could be taken to fix these teething issues is to change the way we see referees from policemakers into judges and people who have the ability to set precedents, um, who to set precedents to laws that require interpretation, thus making the things more streamlined, essentially.
Yeah, yeah, like because like yeah, that's true, and because like make following precedent more closely is what will end up making standards turn into rules, and therefore be able to make, I think ultimately, um, because like the more you have rules, the less room you have for like interpretation and like discussion there. And I think if you have more instances where you just have to just have to look for like fact finding instances, whether or not like this is an infraction or not, ultimately does end up making like the game a lot more smoother and a lot more like incidents free. So that could be
Yeah.
hopefully that could be one like if VAR ends up helping us reconceptualize um, the role of the referee and the function of the laws of the game in football or how they're supposed to be has to work, then I think that could be a long term benefit of VR in that way. So yeah, yeah,
Yeah. I think that brings us to the end of I think it brings us to the end of our episode. First episode in a while, but like
yeah.
it's been fantastic, a nice discussion to have
Mm.
on the dissection of VAR. And yeah, Make sure you hit the subscribe button on the YouTube. Obviously follow us on Spotify,
Mhm.
like, comments, what you thought about the episode, what you think about VAR, and what other episodes you'd like us to do. Obviously, we have like big plunge ahead and guests in mind, but it would be great to see what you guys think about it. So yeah, any last words, Fadhili?
No, yeah, just thanks for listening and watching, and we hope to see you. Okay, I don't know if we'll say soon, but like we hope to see you in the next one.